Perfect. So I'm here with Greener by Default. We're gonna talk a little bit about what Greener by Default does, and specifically why plant-based diets are on the rise and why they're important. So I'm gonna jump right in, and I know we're gonna have some time at the end for a Q&A, so feel free, I think, to drop questions into the chat, or we'll talk later, all right? Okay, so why are we talking about climate action for events, right? Well, studies show that meaningful action on climate change is requested. So 85% of event attendees prefer events with sustainable practices. And then 63% of consumers are trying to eat healthy most of the time or all of the time. And often they're expecting us as event people to be able to help support those goals in their life. So what is the issue? So why are we talking about plant-based diets and why are they on the rise right now? The first one I like to talk about is health. So many of us know someone who's been affected by cancer, heart disease, stroke, obesity, or type 2 diabetes. Those are the top causes of death in the United States. My dad actually had a heart attack, a widowmaker heart attack 5 years ago. He's fine, but he had absolutely no pre-existing conditions. He exercises, he's generally healthy, and the only recommendation that the doctors had for him was to eat less red meat. He's now vegetarian. And the other factor that ties these top leading causes of death together is the fact that people who eat meat-heavy diets, including the American standard meat diet that we often consume, have a higher rate of developing these top 5 conditions that are leading to higher causes of death. Also, from an employee standpoint, from like a corporate standpoint, employees' healthy eating habits are in their best interests because it can reduce absenteeism and improve productivity and actually reduce the cost of healthcare associated problems that are existing. Okay, so the second big issue that we're going to talk about the most right now is the environment. This year, we had our hottest day on record, right? And that's just going to keep getting worse and worse. We all know that. But still, when we talk about the environment, food is getting left out of the conversation, right? So when we think about threats to the environment, we tend to picture cars and smokestacks, not our dinner. But the truth is, our need for food poses one of the biggest dangers to the planet. That's Dr. Jonathan Foley in National Geographic. And several studies have shown actually that if we continue to eat as we currently are with no changes to our diet, we will continue to surpass the 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming that we're trying to remain under. So again, to put that in perspective, if every other industry went carbon neutral, so that's building, transportation, everything else went carbon neutral, but we continue to exist as we're eating, we will still surpass that 1.5 degree Celsius global warming that we're trying to remain under. So we need to do something about what we're doing. And there's one sector in particular that has our largest impact, and that is animal agriculture. It uses 77% of our farmland. It produces 57% of our emissions, so over half of our emissions, but actually only gives us 37% of our protein. And that might surprise you because we're often not discussing our food systems in totality. We're just thinking about the individual food waste. We're thinking about our individual food and water consumption, right? In this diagram, it is represented by what's on top of the iceberg, right? Well, we can see above the waterline. But what we're not actually paying attention to are all these other things that go into feeding 10 billion animals a year for our food consumption. So our food doesn't start at the grocery store. It doesn't start at the restaurant when we start eating it. There are all these other things that go into actual production of raising all of those animals for consumption. And that includes deforestation, water and air pollution. We're going to dive into a couple of those issues right now. So the first I want to talk about is land use. Meat production is the leading cause of the Amazon rainforest being cut down, and that's to make way for grazing land for beef and cattle to grow corn, soy, anything else that's going to feed animals on factory farms as well. So often people turn to things like grass-fed beef as an option, but actually there's only 30% of our farmland that can support our current beef consumption. So we need to cut our beef consumption by 70% to actually maintain levels, or we will continue to have to deforest and ruin all of the wetlands in the United States. So it's not actually a possible solution for everyone to switch to pasture-raised beef. I also want to mention that over the last 50 years, livestock production in the United States has really shifted towards concentrated animal feeding operations, which are called CAFOs. And these are massive industrial operations where animals are confined. So for example, it's like 1,000 or more cows, 10,000 or more pigs, 125,000 or more chickens in one contained area. And extreme overcrowding and squalor in these CAFOs produce actually 90% of the meat and dairy that we are currently consuming in the United States, which is a huge safety risk that we're not talking about as well. The second big environmental issue that I want to talk about is water use. And this is personal for me. I live in Los Angeles for most of the year, and we rely on the Colorado River for our water. The Colorado River is drying up. Last year was the first year that we denied development rights for residential development for water use off the Colorado River. And to put this in perspective, 13% of what we irrigate from the Colorado River goes to residential use for 7 states. That's 40 million people in the Southwest. Los Angeles is included in that. 70% of what we're diverting from the Colorado River is only going to use to grow feed for cattle. So that's alfalfa, corn, grasses, feed for animal production, 70% of what we're diverting from the Colorado River versus 13% that's going to feed 40 million people in residential use. I also want to put it in perspective. This is a great infographic from the New York Times because I often get questions about almond milk, for instance, right? Everyone knows that almonds use a lot of water, but you can see here significantly less use in carbon emissions. So that's across full emissions across land use and across water use than what cow's milk, what dairy milk would be. And just to bring it very personal, if you were to switch out 1 latte's worth of milk from dairy to oat milk, you would save enough water for 2 showers just by that one act every day. And again, I think this might be surprising to people. This might be a conversation you haven't heard much about, and that's pretty intentional. Big meat corporations spend larger percentages of their revenue on funding climate denialism and blocking climate legislation than big oil does. And a study found recently that the top 5 meat and dairy corporations are actually responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than Mobil, Shell, or BP. And yet we're not really hearing about animal ag issues. We're only hearing about fossil fuel issues. And I don't want to like leave you all with doom and gloom. So we're going to move into the solution here, which you may have guessed, for me, is about serving more plant-forward menus. And that's because, on average, the carbon footprint of a plant-based meal is half of that of an animal-based one. When you do beef to plant-based, it's actually a significantly larger leap. But an easy stat is the average meat meal to the average plant-based meal is about half the carbon emissions. And as event people, I want to also share this stat. This is from a study that was on a 100-person meeting they did, and they found that by far the most impactful intervention is switching from beef to veggie burgers. So you can see that's on the left. That's a massive amount of reduction of carbon emissions. Second to that is just reducing the portion size of beef by 25%, which is a strategy we'll talk about a little bit. And then other interventions that we talk about commonly that are really important for other reasons, but may not be as important for carbon emission savings. So when we look at zero waste recycled plastic or zero waste single-use plastic, if we think about those things, you can see they dramatically have less carbon emission reduction value than simply switching or rethinking our menus. Michelle put this great slide together, so I do want to touch on it because I think this is something that Michelle mentioned and something that I remember from my catering days of just how hard it is to be able to actually track and calculate your event emissions. So she has these 3 great carbon calculators for the event industry that you can use. Some of them are cost, some of them are free, but these are very user-friendly, and all you need to know are your menu and your guest count, and it can calculate your food and beverage. And I'll show you, this is an example from one of my clients that is a caterer in New York City. They did these calculations themselves. So at a 600 guest sit-down dinner event, they replaced the beef entree with a vegan one, and they saved over 5,000 kilograms of CO2 emissions, which, using the EPA calculator, which, if you don't know, that is a handy tool online, and there's a link there for you. Using the EPA calculator, they converted the emissions, and that's the equivalent of driving a gas-powered car almost 15,000 miles, charging over 385,000 smartphones, and then planting and growing 96.6 trees for over 10 years. That's the carbon emissions equivalence. So the good news is that we are headed in the right direction, right? Plant-based meals have been a top trend year after year, and it's largely on the rise with young people and omnivores or flexitarians. So you can see over the last 4 years, plant-based menu items have increased 800%. 83% of food service operators actually believe that having plant-based proteins on their menus drive traffic into their restaurants. And 41% of consumers are eating vegan or vegetarian dishes in food service at least once a week. So they're going out and actually ordering them. Also, as event people, you all know how important it is to be accommodating to dietary restrictions. And essentially, these strategies that we're going to talk about in a minute are just making inclusivity the baseline. And that's because the common American diet is actually not inclusive for many people. So 30 to 50 million Americans are lactose intolerant. There are many religions that encourage vegetarianism and restrict animal products. More than half of all Americans are trying to eat less red meat, and nearly a third are trying to eat more plant-based. And then actually BIPOC communities are 3 times more as likely to identify as vegetarian than white communities. And so what we want ultimately is to just make inclusivity through plant-based meals the default option. So when I say something like that, you may not understand what a default is yet, but I'm going to get you there. So a default is the option that people end up with if they're not making an active choice. So when we think about this in our daily lives, we have our default ringtone settings, right? Or your default email settings, right? Those are things that are already there, whether or not you change them. And it's human behavioral science that shows we are way more likely to follow that trajectory than actually try and stick out. Because we are herd animals, right? We want to fit in. We want to seem like we're doing everything else everyone else is doing. Frankly, we're pretty lazy. So more options or changes are actually against our natural behaviors. So people are more likely to hang out with the default option than actively make a change. So if we make the defaults inclusive, then people are more likely to follow them. And I'll share with you the easiest example of the power of defaults, which is organ donation programs. So you'll see all the countries on the left have an opt-in system, and I'll highlight just Germany specifically. So by default, you are not an organ donor in Germany. You have to opt into the process. They have less than 20% of their population as organ donors. The opposite is true in nearby Austria, which is culturally and a relative neighbor to Germany. By default, everyone is an organ donor. 90% of their population are organ donors. And you can see it's not just true with Germany and Austria, it's true for many, many countries. And so when you put that in perspective of menus and plant-based items, you get greener by default and some of the strategies that we're going to talk about. So this is actually a study that we partnered on with UCLA and Harvard to study the impact of plant-based defaults on meal choice at catered events. And you'll see on the left side on a meat-based default, so following a standard American diet, 18.4% of people selected the plant-based meal. But when we flipped the script and we had a plant-based default where people had to opt in for meat and dairy, 65.5% of people actually stuck with the plant-based default. And this is actually a relatively low percentage from some of the other studies that we've seen. I'll show you some examples later, but we've done implementation where it has actually increased by over 80 percentage points. So this can be a huge impact just by switching that one idea that we have of how we eat our meals. Another way to look at it is in this graph. So you think about on the left side, we have our meat lovers, people on a carnivore diet who are looking for meat in every single meal that they have. And on the right side, we have our vegans, right? We have about 4% of the population that identify as vegan and vegetarian right now in the United States. But the massive amount of people are flexitarians, right? This is a huge portion of the population. So they're eating both. They're happy to eat both. So what we do is we just gear things towards them eating more plant-based. Okay, so how it works. So luckily, I do feel like this is the part where people get a little stuck sometimes, where people are like, that sounds cool, this sounds fun and exciting, but I'm not exactly sure how to implement it in my work. And so we've come up, there are a lot of studies, a lot of science-based facts about how to do this. And we've come up with about 7 main strategies that we kind of follow. So I'm going to dive into each of these a little deeper, and then I would be happy to also talk afterwards about how you all can think of implementing some of this in your sustainable practices as well. So the first one, the most effective one, is what I talked about earlier, so plant-based defaults. So serving plant-based as a default with the option to add in meat or dairy. When we do this, we see that diners are 7 times more likely to select a plant-based meal. And you can do this in a bunch of different settings, right? We see this at Sweetgreens or Chipotle, right? Like they have a bowl that's a base that is plant-based by default. And then you can add things to it. So you can add your meat, or you can add your dairy, or you can add your tofu, right? But on its own, it is an entree that is plant-based by default. The easiest way you can do this at an event is with your RSVP. So thinking about our opt-in, opt-out language, if everyone is just given a plant-based meal by default, but then people have the opportunity to opt into a different meal if they don't want the plant-based one. Just that one shift in language is massive. We can also do this in a buffet style. We often see that putting a plant-based item first on your buffet line allows people to fill up their plates and eat more plant-based items. And then you put the meat and dairy at the end as kind of a garnish or the last thought. It dramatically reduces the amount of meat and dairy that people have. Another way you can do this is with oat milk, which we've seen very effectively. We actually implemented an oat milk default at the LinkedIn San Francisco office. They cut dairy milk from 70% to 18% of milk served, and it reduced their carbon footprint by over 50%. Okay, the second biggest bang for your buck that you can get is if you are unable to do a plant-based default, you can make the perception that plant-based items are plentiful and that they're more likely to take things. So the science behind this shows that when 2/3 of menu items are meat-based, when it's switched to 2/3 that are vegetarian-based, it increases people's selection of over 50%. And this kind of comes from the idea that we'll revisit in a couple of these strategies, but people who identify as vegan and vegetarian are going to eat the vegan and vegetarian items, but we want to capture this flexitarian group, right? Again, so we don't want to actually focus on the fact that they have to identify as vegan or vegetarian to eat items. So when you see something on a menu or you see something on a buffet line and it is the one vegetarian item, you as a flexitarian are probably thinking, oh, I don't identify as a vegetarian, so I'm not going to take that item. But when there's an abundance of options and it's just the normal to have a bunch of plant-based foods, then of course, as a flexitarian, you're saying, oh, I would like to eat chickpea curry, or I would like to eat this salad that happens to be plant-based and I'm not even thinking about it, right? So creating the illusion that there is an abundance of foods really goes a long way. All right, our third strategy we call subtle substitutions. So it's serving plant-based condiments, milks, desserts, breads by default. Basically anything on the side is what I say. And our real world study for this is that a school district in Colorado removed eggs and milk from their baked goods, and they saved more than $10,000 annually and as much carbon emissions as driving 50,000 miles in a gas-powered vehicle. This is also a really important strategy these days when it comes to eggs. Avian flu is on the rise and it's just coming back, and we all know egg prices are fluctuating a lot. So this can be a really powerful strategy to just replace your eggs with flax or applesauce or another binding agent and remove eggs completely. And then you're no longer reliant on what the trends are for avian flu and how that increases prices. All right, our fourth strategy we call prime placement. So placing plant-based items first on the menu or in buffet lines. So that's in each category in your menu. A study from the World Resource Institute found that placing these plant-based dishes first increases selection by more than 50%. Something along the lines of the vegetarian, I identify as vegan or I identify as vegetarian. If you actually incorporate these things into the menu instead of having a separate menu for vegan and vegetarian, people again aren't identifying as, oh, I'm a vegan or vegetarian, I need to order off the menu. Instead, it's incorporated into your main menu and it's just another plant-based offering that you can have. Also, I will mention, if you are doing sales for your clients or you're helping negotiate menus, if you are recommending plant-based options as your specialty or as something that you love, it goes a very long way towards convincing other people that that's something they want. There's a lot of science behind expert opinions and being able to move people in the direction of wanting more plant-based items by you just expressing that this is a chef's special, or this is the most popular item, or this is one that I love very much. That actually goes a really far way towards people adopting more plant-based items. Okay, our fifth strategy is called tasty titles. And that means labeling dishes with enticing names that focus on the senses or taste rather than using terms like vegan or vegetarian. World Resource Institute found that actually removing the word meatless from an item increased sales by 76%. And so something that goes along with this is, like, we don't want to be reminded of something we're losing here, right? Low fat, vegan, meatless make people think that they're losing something in the process of eating it. Whereas if we actually frame something as tasty and indulgent, or we focus on the flavor, the texture, or where it's from, people are more likely to want to eat that, right? We actually have done this with a software company, and we have really cool stats around a vegetarian hummus wrap is what they used to call it. And they changed it just to be a roasted red pepper, avocado, and hummus wrap, and their sales increased dramatically. The other example I really like to give in this area is, if you see a celiac bowl on a menu, for example, but you're not gluten-free or you don't have celiacs, you're probably not likely to order it, right? But if we call it a Thai peanut noodle salad or a Thai peanut noodle bowl, that appeals to anyone who is interested in those kinds of flavors. So the same thing applies for vegan and vegetarianism. Okay, our last strategy that I alluded to a little earlier is about meat reduction. So serving smaller portions of meat, but increasing your plant-based ingredients. So this is a new study out of Stanford University that showed the portion size can be reduced of meat by 25% without any change in diner satisfaction. So when you meet the 50%, when you remove 50% of the meat, people start to complain. But at 25% of meat reduction, people don't notice the difference. And this is specifically around like burritos or fajitas, those kinds of things that you can actually increase the amount of vegetable items in, but decrease the amount of meat products included. And I will just share a few case studies here, because we've had great success. And I think sometimes, again, this concept can feel really out there or not real worldly. And we actually have great strategies being implemented every day at all these different institutions. So the first one I want to cover is the New York Health and Hospital System. So this is a great partnership that we have with New York City Mayor's office. And they actually offered patients 2 chef specials, which are both vegan. And their results have shown that there is a 50% participation with a 90% satisfaction rate. And they're actually saving 59 cents per meal and shifting over 800,000 meals annually. So they are a huge success. We piloted it at one of their hospitals, and they have now actually rolled it out to all 11 public hospitals in the New York City system. Oh, and 36% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which is giant.